Good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 Virtual Wellbeing Conference, part of Connect 2021. My name is Ian Hart and I'm the editor of SHP. I hope you're enjoying the content so far. Next up, we have Nichola Ebbern, who's the Head of Health and Safety at Shepherd's Bush Housing Group, who's going to share her personal experience of living with an invisible disability and provide some advice on how employees can support. Nichola is passionate about health and safety. Her background is diverse, with an experience in a variety of organisations such as Battersea Dogs and Cats Home, Christie's Auction House, MCOR and Capita. Nichola also has an extensive military experience as an army officer in the Royal Military Police. The combination of civilian and military experience has led Nichola to develop a broad skill set, and she's able to provide a strong leadership and H&S technical skills. Nichola's had great success in leading organisations to help create healthier and safer working environments and improving their overall safety culture. Currently at Shepherd's Bush Housing Group, as head of H&S, Nichola is helping the business transform health and safety culture to generate generative state with strong emphasis on managing colleagues in a compassionate way. At the moment, a key focus is preparing for the new building of fire safety requirements, as well as supporting colleagues with their wellbeing during these challenging times. Nichola, over to you for the presentation. And I would say, just before you start, Nichola, this is an interactive live session, and so please do get your questions in for Nichola as we go on throughout the presentation, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can at the end. Nichola, over to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Ian. So as Ian said, I'm going to share with you today a very personal story about my journey through dealing with an invisible disability. And what I hope to achieve through that is to give you some ideas and some insight into what it's like to have an invisible disability, but also to give you some ideas for how you could address it in your business. Before I do that, I'd just like to talk a little bit about stigma, because that's actually been really important in my journey. So there's two kinds of stigma. There's the social stigma, which is where the prejudiced attitudes of others affect groups. And that's not really what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is self-perceived stigma. So that's where our own thoughts around either how we feel or how we believe others view us influence our behaviour in life. And for me, my self-perceived stigma has been a real challenge, because I think that people will think that I can't cope. So I've always felt, until recently, I'd always felt that if I shared my story and people understood some of the challenges that I had in my daily life, they would think I couldn't deal with work and that I wouldn't be able to deliver. But I'm driven by perfectionism. So actually, that makes it, I'm more driven to succeed. Through lockdown, not only have I felt more disabled than ever because of the impact of the restrictions have had on my physical and mental health, but I've also had a lot of time to reflect and to think about where I am, where I've been and where I'm going. And as part of that, I think I've come to embrace the fact that my life is different now and has been different for very many years. And what I want to do is help others to address what's really an unspoken topic of invisible disabilities. It's not something that we really talk about, and actually it has a really big impact on equality and fairness in the workplace. So I was diagnosed with breast cancer at a very young age, and that was it's unusual. Normally it is older women that are diagnosed with breast cancer. It was actually so unusual that the clinicians told me there was nothing for me to worry about. It actually turned out I had stage 3 cancer, which is very aggressive. And as a result of that, once I'd had that diagnosis from the biopsy, I then went on to have a further 2 operations and a full suite of treatment, which included chemotherapy, radiotherapy, hormone therapy, and the cancer drugs. And that has gone on for many years, because the treatment path is quite long for that. And breast cancer is one of the cancers that's particularly challenging, because where in other areas you would get the all clear and you would be confident that the cancer was gone and that it wasn't going to come back, that's not the case with breast cancer and cancers that are similar to breast cancer. It can come back at any time, but also it can come back anywhere. So, for example, I could have what's biologically breast cancer in my bones, for example. So it's you never quite know what's going to happen or where, which is quite a thing to have to deal with once you've got the diagnosis, because it's not just finished and you've had it chopped out and you're better. So when I was going through all my treatment, not only was I experiencing all the side effects that you'd expect from normal cancer treatment, things like hair loss, weight loss, and I was very sick, But I also I went through the menopause as a result of the hormone drugs I was given, and I also experienced chronic fatigue. So my reflexes were really slow. My friends talked about the fact that I had obvious pain in the way that I moved, and all of that was linked to those things. What I found at that point, the business where I was working was incredibly supportive. They were really kind and understanding. There was a lot of flexibility. There was a lot of support from my colleagues. And I felt really nurtured, and that was really great. And I think for me, the important thing around that is that I looked very ill. I had no hair. It was obvious that there was something not right with me. But then I started to feel better. The main treatment ended, the chemotherapy and the radiotherapy ended. I started to look much better. My hair came back. And the business very much then started to think that I would return to business as usual. And that wasn't, I didn't feel like that. I still was dealing with the impact, the mental impact and the physical impact of all of the treatment and the shock of what I was going through. And with hindsight, I have wondered whether there was an element of compassion fatigue. So when I worked at Battersea Dogs Home, it was certainly something that I worked with my colleagues quite a lot around. When you're constantly giving, it can be very draining on you emotionally. And I certainly started to feel that the perception was I couldn't cope at work. So the impact of what happened there is that I then decided not to share. I didn't disclose to work that I had a medical condition because I was able to most of the time manage it myself, and I didn't feel the need to tell my workplace employer around that. I also my mental health wasn't amazing because I wasn't able to address my work issues and my personal issues because I was keeping a secret, if you like, and having to kind of juggle that perception at work against how I was actually feeling. And I was really worried as I've changed jobs. I became very worried about my ability to be recruited, and the fact that if I discussed this with a recruiter or I disclosed it very early on in the process, that the perception would be very much I couldn't do this job. So you'll be hearing from me that I've got a real drive to deliver, and I was really worried that drive to deliver and that ability would be questioned as a result of having an invisible disability. And I looked well, but I didn't feel it. So as we moved down the years, my hair got longer, I gained weight back, I started to look healthy. But inside, that wasn't how I felt. I continued to suffer from chronic fatigue, and I had a really limited energy budget. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a minute. And I also developed a condition called lymphedema. So lymphedema is a very common condition that women develop after having breast cancer, and there are other reasons why you would get it as well. And what that is it's a swelling in my arm. So the lymph is unable to drain as a result of the operations that I've had, and that gives me neurological pain, and it can be very restrictive when the swelling is particularly bad. I also developed osteopenia. So it's not quite osteoporosis. I didn't have brittle bones, but my bones were definitely thinning, and I'd lost quite a lot of density. So that's quite a lot to manage on a daily basis. And what I wanted to talk to you about a little bit is just what a week looks like for me and some of the things that I have to think about. And the reason for sharing this with you is so that you can start to understand as an employer what's happening in the background for somebody who is suffering a similar an invisible disability. The fact that it's not just what you see at work. So I mentioned my energy budget. For me, it's all about balancing the demands of work. So I see it as I have a finite amount of energy that I can use every day, and I have to decide what I'm going to do. So is it work? Is it seeing friends and doing stuff that I really enjoy? Is it exercising? And I'm going to talk a bit more about the importance of exercising to me in a minute. Or is it doing household chores? Because I can't do all of those things in the same way that my friends and my colleagues at work can. So a really good example of a household chore is going to the supermarket, and I am loving the development of home delivery. It has definitely helped me in terms of managing my energy budget, but also nutrition is really important to me. So I focus on meal planning for bone health. So I eat specifically to make sure that I'm getting the right nutrients to increase the density of my bones. And I've also done a lot of personal research into the link between cancer and nutrition. So I eat very little meat, very little processed meat. So that meal planning process is something that I go through on a weekly basis, add things into my shopping cart, get it delivered. I save some energy. It's brilliant. And then I'm also looking to do things like batch cook, so that when I'm really fatigued and I just need to get into a position where I can relax and switch off and go to bed, I've got something on hand to just quickly eat. In health and safety, we've started to talk about the sleep hygiene quite a lot. It's become something that's really important, and we recognise the importance of that. And for me, that's particularly so. I'm looking to have a really strong routine. I would go to bed at the same time, get up at the same time, and that has a real impact on my personal life. It's about juggling what it is that I'm going to do. And then the last thing is around exercise. So I'm looking to fit as much exercise as I can manage into my daily routine. It helps me to manage my stress, and it also helps me to maintain positive mental health. And I see it as self-care to do that exercise. But it links back to the energy budget in terms of how much can I do today? What else is important to me? So as you can see, there's a lot going on before I even actually do anything in a day in terms of working out how all of this is going to fit together. And this is where work has a really important part to play. So a line manager has massive impact on me, whether that's a positive impact or a negative impact, depending on how the relationship is. And that link between employee and line manager is really invaluable. So for me, what a really good line manager looks like is somebody who is going to have a fact-based conversation. So everybody will deal with their invisible disability differently. They'll see it differently. I see it very fact-based. And so when I've had a line manager who doesn't express judgment or pity, that really works for me. And the best line manager that I ever had recognised that my desire to deliver results will often be at the expense of my own well-being. So she would notice signs that I'm starting to burn out, and would say to me, by the way, think about what's happening. She'd use that insight to encourage me to think about what was happening, think about my deadlines, and maybe reframe any negative thoughts that I was having around that. And that support it didn't take up much of her time. It was just, she dealt with me in a kind way, having taken the time to get to know me and how that would work for me. And I think that links to the organisational framework. So depending on how your organisation has set up your approach for dealing with disabilities, and particularly invisible disabilities, that sets the tone for how line managers will then follow that through in terms of their behaviours. So we all love data, and we all want to capture it because we want to know, want to analyse it and look into it. And I think my experience is that sometimes the wording, when I'm being asked to declare my disability, is difficult. It can make it uncomfortable to do that. So it's about, I think, as an organisation, looking at what it is that you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it, and what might be the barriers that you haven't even thought of. So once you've got that approach, obviously that then follows that you would have policies and procedures around your approach to recruitment and the business approach to reasonable adjustments, but particularly training and guidance for line managers. Having a conversation with somebody about something that's really personal and possibly quite emotional can be really difficult. And the Healthy Work Company, I recently attended one of their courses around conversations for wellbeing, and it really pulled together all of the things that I had thought about in terms of how a good conversation is run. And I just wanted to share that with you today. Heather very kindly said that I could use it. So for line managers, they work on an ABCD model. So A is about awareness, And I referenced earlier that the best line manager I ever had was very kind. She was kind and she was very open, but not awkward. And that really worked for me. It was great. Being present is important. I think it's really easy to, particularly at the moment with COVID, when we're all working from home and things are quite often more hectic than they were before because we're trying to cram so much into a day virtually. It's about taking the time as the line manager to check into with yourself, to make sure that you've ring-fenced the preparation time and the meeting time so that you can focus on your employee. And then obviously you want some outputs from this. This is a formal relationship and it's about understanding what the individual needs and how that's going to work itself out. So that's about co-creating a plan. And one of the questions that I found really works for me as a line manager, but also as being managed, is the question around, do you want me to listen or do you want me to provide solutions? Because sometimes I just need to share, and sometimes I don't really know where I'm going with it and I want to have that help. And likewise with the people that I manage, similar conversations. So that co-creation of the plan, that understanding what the employee wants from that conversation is really important. And then lastly, it's about duties. So as a line manager, it's important to recognise that we have responsibilities around health and safety, linked to the Health and Safety Work Act, keeping everybody safe at work, but also the Equality Act. And I just want to touch a little bit on that. So within the Equality Act, there are 3 illnesses which automatically class you as disabled. Cancer is one of them. So on the day of my diagnosis, I, according to the Equalities Act, became disabled. HIV and multiple sclerosis are the other 2. But the scope is really broad because they then move on to talk about long-term health conditions, which they define as a condition that lasts for over 12 months or is a progressive condition. So we're talking about things like chronic fatigue syndrome, which is called ME, some kinds of arthritis, fibromyalgia, COPD, and of course it wouldn't be a good presentation without mentioning COVID. So long COVID, that's going to start to have an impact of people having long-term health conditions. But it's not just about having that health condition, it's also about the impact that it has on your day-to-day activity. And I think what I hope is by talking through some of the things that I have to think about and some of the things that I have to manage, that highlights what it means when they talk about the effect on the person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. My life is different from what it was before my diagnosis, and that is quite a significant impact. So then if you fall into one of those categories, or you work with somebody who falls into one of those categories, there's then a requirement to make reasonable adjustments. And that will depend on the individual, it will depend on their condition, and that's where this conversation is really important. So having spoken about the ABCD model in terms of how the conversation can be had, I just wanted to also share some other experiences that I've had that may apply to other people as well. So as you've probably sensed from the story that I've told, I found this a very hard subject to discuss openly initially. For me, it was very private and very personal. And I know for lots of people that I know, that's very similar in terms of it can be hard to have that question. But what can really help is probing gently for the person that you're talking to ask those questions and to pick up on the language that's being used so that you're echoing the person that you're talking to's approach. And don't be scared of not knowing how to respond. I think that was one of the hardest things that I had to address was not only my own feelings, but how other people would respond. And it's just about being honest and having empathy for that individual and understanding where they're coming from. And linked to that is about leaving your judgments and your opinions aside for one moment, because you will all have had either an experience or an opinion around somebody who has breast cancer. But actually, everybody has their own experience. And if you're trying to support somebody, what I've found best is where the person understands how I feel about it, rather than imposing their thoughts onto my experience. And this kind of links to language as well. So I've mentioned about asking questions and not being afraid around how to respond. And that kind of links to language. So it can be it's about knowing the individual that you're talking to. So, for example, I've had a line manager refer to me as brave and a cancer and congratulated me on being a cancer survivor. But that isn't at all how I see myself. I don't see myself as either of those things. I'm ex-military. I have done some things which I consider brave. Going through a process within the NHS is just something that I had to do. For me, it wasn't bravery. And that's quite important to understand, because there are absolutely people who I know and who I've worked with in the past who did see themselves in that light, and that's fantastic, because that's who they are and that's how they see their experience, and it's right that they should be recognised for that. And I think it's about, if you're not sure, just ask the question about terminology and that kind of thing. And then lastly, it's about hearing what's been said and also what isn't being said. So I think it's about recognising that this is, once you have that initial conversation, it will be the first of many, and there will be ups and downs. There'll be good days, there'll be bad days, but a line manager is really important. The impact that they can have is significant. So it's about working working together to get the right outputs that you need to ensure that person is as productive as they can be in the workplace. And if any of you are listening to this session and you have an invisible disability, and maybe like me, your self-perceived stigma has meant that you haven't shared it or talked about it, I urge you to be brave. I urge you to find your voice, to share your story, and if there's a problem at work, maybe that's why you're nervous about it, find an employer that's supportive and caring, because there are loads of them out there. And also, you can only have the reasonable adjustments that you need from your workplace if you declare it. So there's kind of two reasons for doing it. And that's it. I think I just want to say lastly, just no matter whether you have an invisible disability or not, everybody brings amazing things to the workplace when we bring our whole selves. And what I really want to do is get that topic uncovered. So I'm going to welcome Ian back now and see if there's any questions.
Perfect, Nichola. Thank you so much for sharing that story. I think I'm sure there's so many people out there who's going to find that presentation really, really valuable. So really appreciate your time this morning. I've had a few questions in. A couple of them I want to kind of tie together because they kind of relate a little bit. So from a manager's point of view, is there any way to spot an invisible disability? And the second point to that, how would you go about starting a conversation with someone you suspected is struggling with an invisible disability? You mentioned obviously language a little bit there, but what advice have you got there?
So I think it links to anybody who's struggling at work, and that is becoming harder to spot when we're working remotely. It's about asking somebody if everything is okay, and we're quite often people will say yes, everything's fine, but then it's about going back and asking that question a second time and maybe saying something, you know, I've noticed that you've done X differently, are you sure you're okay? And giving that person the opportunity to open up, because I think that can be the hardest thing, that first step. And I know for a long time I wanted to share, I just didn't really know how to, and I wasn't sure how it was going to pan out. And another tip I've heard from other people is that sometimes it can really help if you think somebody is struggling, to also say, you know, I wonder how you're doing, because I'm finding it really hard at the moment because I can't see my family, or whatever it is that you're finding it difficult. But that needs to be authentic so that you can link to the person. So there's no magic badge, I'm afraid, that says I have an invisible disability. Well, there is, but not many people will be wearing it, because if they are, then they've already disclosed it.
No longer invisible then. There's a couple of couple of questions here I want to tie together. You obviously spoken that you kept this story to yourself for a long time, but now you felt comfortable to speaking out about it. So how did that moment come when you decided to mention it to your manager? Did you decide to go through HR first, and what kind of prompted that decision? And sort of secondary point, have you noticed a significant change in the stigma related to mental health illnesses in recent years, and did that have some part to play?
Okay. But part of the reason why I did decide to share initially was around I was asked to be in the office. So for years I'd worked from home with frequent site visits and frequent office visits, but I would have at least 1 day a week at home. And I changed for a role where I would be 5 days a week in the office. And I really wanted the job, but I also knew that I wouldn't be able to do 5 days a week in the office with the commuting time. It would just be too much for my fatigue. And so that was, I thought about how much I wanted the job versus how much I didn't want to share, and the desire for the job won, so I did share. And then since then I've been much more open, because that was a really positive experience for me. And then the link to stigma, I definitely think that we talk about it more, and that's really positive, because it means that we can start, anybody who's suffering can start that conversation. I do still think there's a lot of work to be done. I think sometimes it depends. It comes down to who your line manager is, and that can make that conversation easy or not. But I think the stigma is starting to move away from mental health, which is good.
You mentioned a little bit there about kind of flexible working, and it kind of relates to where we are as a society at the moment. Do you think that the increased acceptance of flexible working moving forward will benefit people that are suffering from invisible illnesses, or will it hinder it?
I think it's definitely a positive thing. I think the leaps and bounds that we've had with technology are brilliant for people with visible and invisible disabilities. If you just think about your mobile phone and the fact that you can talk to your mobile phone and it will write a message for you, that's a fantastic thing that 30 years ago we didn't have. So I think technology has definitely made the workplace more accessible, and as has that flexible working, because it means that we have the ability, like I have the ability to choose a bit more about where I work, and to work with an employer to be able to go to work in a way that works for me.
Time for probably one more. So you talked a little bit about your energy budget there. And you also talked about how your real drive to hit goals and succeed. And did you find that a little bit difficult at first, try not to do too much?
I wouldn't say at first. I still find it a bit difficult not to do too much. And that's where the value of a line manager is really good, because as I say, my line manager is amazing, and she would spot, because there's little tells which I don't even know that I have. I just can't see them, and she would spot them and be able to support me by saying, maybe it's time to take a break. And I've had other line managers that have done that as well. So that link is really important. But in terms of doing too much, I really struggle, because for me it was such a break. I was going from, I had a full-time, relatively senior role in health and safety. I had a part-time role in the army. I was a captain in the military police. So I was doing that on top of my day job. I was running kind of 30 to 40 miles a week. There was lots and lots crammed into my week. And even now I struggle with the fact that I can't get as much in. So yes, it's an ongoing struggle that I have to deal with.
Quickly, finally, you mentioned running there. Obviously, you mentioned in your article. So Nicola's written a piece on the subject on SHP. So please go to shponline.co.uk and search for her name, and you can read that. But you mentioned running there, and how that was a big stress reliever for you, and that you're no longer able to do that. What do you do instead now to help relieve stress?
I am loving yoga. So yoga is really good for lymphedema, because the breathing accesses the lymph system. So it helps my lymphedema. It also helps me to kind of relieve that stress. And I've done quite a lot of research into it as part of some of the courses I've delivered at work around wellbeing at work. And there's starting to be lots of science that backs up the fact that yoga is good for you more than just your physical health. It really has an impact on your mental health as well.
Perfect, Nichola. Thank you so much for your time today. That's all we've got time for. Nichola mentioned a couple of things in her presentation there, one about fatigue and sleep hygiene, and you can find more on this subject from sleep expert Marcus de Gingang at 11:45 on Thursday. And she also mentioned Heather Beach from the Healthy Work Company, who's going to be speaking more about the ABCD model at 12 noon tomorrow. So be sure to check out those sessions. If you can't see them live, they will be available on demand throughout June and July. Following immediately after this session, we've got a session from NEBOSH CEO Dee Arp, who is going to tell you all you need to know about NEBOSH's wellbeing qualification. Nichola, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for joining the session, interacting, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. My name is Ian Hart.